Just a reminder, this is a commission workshop. This is specifically for you all to ask consultant team and staff questions to dive a little deeper into this draft land use and transportation plan. You all will hear this at your agenda next week. On your agenda. So we're really looking forward to sharing with you the details. Again, we've been working on this for the last 2 years, so we've had some workshops with you, but this is probably the first time that we've really had to deep dive into looking at the draft plan. And just a reminder, it has been posted on our website since October, and very little changes have been made to it in that time. In the materials in front of you, you have the agenda, and then you have a document at the end. Good morning, Commissioner. Items revised from the October draft. And I sent all this information to you all via email in advance. I hope you've had a chance to take a look at it. Additionally, I just want to point out a couple things that we can talk as we go through the day, but the Knox County Relationship of Plans is changing, what that looks like. The place type categories and zoning, which we'll dive a little deeper into. And then I printed you all off a copy of the plan itself. You have an electronic copy, but I want to make sure you have it for today. So just briefly to review the agenda, I'll go over some introductions here in a minute. We want to talk about that plan, purpose, and background. Give you the overview of the planning process. Again, some of this will be repeat from some of you all because you've been involved since the very beginning, but we really want to take it down to the basics. And then we'll talk about the future land use map, that draft map, implementation measures, and how we intend to amend this going forward, and then to track our progress over time. And then throughout this, I think we're comfortable with taking questions as we go through the presentation, so feel free to, if something comes to mind, if you have a comment or question, please jump in. That agenda sound okay to everybody? All right, so just some brief introductions. So what we call our advanced Knox team, most of you know us, but just as a reminder, we have Mandy Benedict from the Mayor's Office. We have Jim Snowden from Engineering Public Works. Kathy Olson has been our project manager throughout this, and we have Adam Ketron. And then from our team, we have Michelle Porche, and then Terry Gahula, who's our Director of Information and Research. And then our consultant team is led by Kinley Moore. Some of you have met Christina Whitfield before, and then she's brought her colleague Jonathan Whitehurst with us. I'm going to give you okay, so our plan is, as many of you know, it's over 20 years old now. This is our general plan. And so to be effective, a plan really does need to be periodically updated to account for changes in condition, new data, new technologies, and other changes that the community might experience over time. And so over the past 20 years, the county region have, as you all know, we hear about this on a monthly basis, has experienced such a really significant amount of growth, changes in demographics, market shifts, and then obviously with the global pandemic, which did shift sort of how we do business in a lot of ways. Countywide growth is anticipated to continue over the next 2 decades. By 2045, the county is projected to reach over 550,000 new residents, and we don't expect this continued influx of new residents to change much. So, and it's going to be a primary factor influencing how we grow over the next 20 years. Knox County is a really attractive place to be at. There was a headline today that Knoxville specifically is definitely on the map as a mid-sized city that's very desirable and people want to move to our area. And I think that has a lot to do with the community pride that we have here in our county, and that it's such a beautiful place, and it's generally an easy place to live. And so there is a strong desire by the community to maintain those characteristics, as we grow. That's really important. That's one thing I really did here. So in response to increased development pressures and requests from the community back in 2021, Mayor Jacobs launched this advanced Knox process. And the purpose was define what our vision is for the next 20 years and create that plan that's going to guide land use and transportation investments over the years to come. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about our growth policy plan today, but I think it's important to briefly discuss this plan and what it does and doesn't do, and put it into context with some of the other tools that we have as a community to use. You all consider the growth policy plan on a monthly basis, so you're quite familiar with it, but just to give you a little bit of background, the growth policy plan is intended to establish 3 areas, which is the urban growth area, the planned growth area, and the rural area. And as part of this update to our comprehensive land use and transportation plan, we did take a look at the boundaries, and that map is going through the process now. But of all of our plans, the growth policy plan and map is really the most general of our tools. And so reading this map does not tell us everything that's shown in yellow, for instance, is going to be suburban residential development, or that every parcel in the rural areas is going to be farm. What it does tell us is that areas in yellow have been identified as places that future growth might be able to be accommodated for a variety of reasons. And there are things that when you look at this, you can't necessarily make sense of, but you can begin to understand when we lay that comprehensive land use and transportation plan over it. So the growth policy plan answers the most general questions of where could growth be accommodated, and the comprehensive plan answers questions about what types of land uses are most appropriate in what different areas. So this is the point where we begin to understand where residential development might occur and where mixed use centers, for example, might be more appropriate. So what is a comprehensive plan or general plan? A lot of communities call them general plan. Our old plan is called the general plan. It is that long-term guide that is intended to express the values of the community, the aspirations, needs, and the unique conditions of our communities and of those neighborhoods that make up the community. It is intended to establish an integrated vision for growth and infrastructure investments. It's intended to be a tool that will prepare us for change. As I mentioned earlier, we are experiencing a lot of population growth, and with that comes change. And it's intended to act as a business plan or a guidebook for decision makers like you. So the purpose of this plan is to make recommendations for land use and transportation. It outlines policies and guidance on how the county can guide growth into the future. And again, so the creation of this plan really was the focus of this whole advanced Knox process. So it will inform zoning and other small area plans and studies as we move forward. So when you look at this, the future land use map, as I was comparing it to the growth policy plan, you really can see much more nuance and understand what places, even within the planned growth area, might remain more rural in character, which areas that might be more appropriate for traditional style suburban growth, which we heard during the community input that people still want to see that traditional suburban development, and where we might see more intense uses. As I mentioned, this process has taken place over the last 2 years. It's involved a very thorough analysis of data, and it's involved a lot of community members, thousands of community members participating in this process. And so I'm going to turn over to Christina now, and she is going to walk you through the process that we took to develop the plan, the outcomes, and we're going to talk about proposed implementation strategies.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for having us today. We're really excited to be here, and we're really excited to be this close to the end of the process and getting to see this get adopted and implementation actually starting to take form from everything that we've worked so hard with staff and the community on over the past 2 years. If you've been with us before, you've probably seen this graphic. We just wanted to quickly revisit kind of the key phases of the advanced Knox process and what we went through to get to this point today. So we started back in November 2021. Our team came down. We got to have a day of staff and Mayor Jacobs, and we did a countywide tour, got to kind of explore and see everything that was kind of the hot topic issues that you all see monthly on your agendas firsthand. And then we moved into starting to understand kind of what we call the state of the county. That was a document that was published back in the early half of 2022 that you guys probably had seen. I think planning staff had nice print copies up at the front desk that people could take if they wanted to. So as we were considering how the county wants to grow and develop in the future, understanding our baseline of where we are today and some of those historic trends was really, really important. And that was kind of that baseline setting for that section. Our scenarios process, we'll spend quite a bit of time kind of underlying this today because it really was the meat of the advanced Knox process. It was something that was really unique to this process compared to a lot of comprehensive planning efforts that really grounded our entire process in a really heavy data-driven analysis approach to getting to where we ended up with in the implementation framework. And then all of that led into our draft plan recommendations, which we'll spend a really large portion of our time today kind of talking through some of those policies and actions and recommendations coming out of advanced Knox that help you guys achieve the vision of the future land use map and some of those other key components. And here we are today with you guys talking about our adoption process. So as Amy mentioned, it will be on your all's agenda next week, and hopefully we'll be taking it to County Commission in March. So Amy did a really good job teeing this up, so I won't spend too much time here, but when we came out to the community for the first time back starting in 2021, we really needed to set the stage with what a comprehensive plan was. We wanted them to understand that this is the blueprint that shows you guys how you can grow and how you should grow in the future, but also kind of get them to start thinking about how this guides local decision making, whether that be from your rezonings, your code amendments, any of that stuff kind of should start at the heart of this bigger overarching comprehensive plan so that you guys have what we like to kind of refer to as a North Star for how you make those decisions throughout the way. And I think one of the really important things we tried to hit on here, and I think this is one of the things that resonated with folks, in the absence of local planning, somebody's going to make the decisions for you. So this tool is the thing that allows you guys to have that kind of, for lack of better terms, the control over the future and how the county grows so that you have a little bit more input and say on how our community looks and how we maintain that character that we're all so proud of. So, like all good comprehensive or general plans, we started at the highest level with a vision. During some of our first community outreach efforts, we came out with just blank slips of paper and we told folks to tell us what they love about Knox County. I think if you guys have ever talked to anyone from here or somebody who, like me, got to come to school here and now doesn't get to live here, there's some things that I look back on. It's like, man, I really miss that about Knox County. And we got to hear all of that. And that was used and kind of aggregated together to come up with our vision for the plan, which is a thriving county that honors its natural beauty and cultural heritage while supporting diverse people and businesses. Those are both just from reoccurring things we heard from the community. So as we went out to each group of folks, everyone just told us how much they love the natural beauty of Knox County, how they love the people. The people are so good. It's just a great place to be. So we wanted to honor that and kind of their desires through our vision statement. The vision is kind of our broadest level of the kind of pyramid or umbrella. We wanted to take that one step further into our goals for the Advanced Knox plan. So I'm not going to read these verbatim, but I will hit on each of them just very quickly. Community character was one of the strongest things we heard over and over through the Advanced Knox process, really wanting to make sure that we have strong places with distinct identity. If you go out to the community and talk to folks from PAL, you're going to hear all about how much they love about PAL and what that means to them. And that was something that we heard no matter which community or which kind of part of the county we were in. For our conservation, kind of back to that natural beauty, there was a strong desire from the community at large to make sure that we were protecting our hillsides, ridgetops, that we're protecting our view sheds and things that make Knox County the beautiful place that it is today. Infrastructure investment, this is, we'll hit on transportation in a minute, but this was really thinking about making sure that those utilities and some of those more invisible pieces that we don't always see to the naked eye are in place and that we're investing in them intentionally to prepare for that future or planned growth. And then economic growth kind of speaks to itself. Just Knox County is an attractive place. Amy mentioned that. It's going to continue to be, and part of that is the great business environment and kind of the economic opportunity here. The workforce to support that was a big focus of conversation, making sure that we continue to engage and attract folks who can come here and work and help support that economic growth. And then as we get into housing options, that was one of the ones that was a pretty hot topic throughout the planning process. And one of the things that we kept hearing was making sure that there was a range of types and choices. You got folks graduating from UT who may not stay around because they can't immediately afford a $400,000 single family home in one of our Knox County subdivisions. Or the folks that want to age in place and want something a little bit smaller. But then also that affordability was a really big piece of some of the underlying conversations that everyone was sharing with us. And then finally, for our transportation and recreation goals, just making sure that we have that connected network and system that is safe and allows people the opportunities to get about the county, whether that be for actual transportation or via our great trails or waterways for recreational purposes. So who was involved? You guys have probably heard a little bit about some of these groups through our previous meetings, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of three key buckets on this little graph for you guys. We had our advisory committee. Those folks were representative of the whole county as a group of about 25. We had somebody from each of the commission districts. We had folks from different organizations and agencies. We had developers. We had planning advocates. It was a hodgepodge of folks, and they were invited by the mayor to be on that committee, and they were kind of our I like to call them our guinea pigs or our vetting board before we took anything to the public, before we brought anything to commissions or councils, that we ran everything through them, let them poke holes in it, and tell us what they thought, and then we would refresh that, refine it, and bring it kind of up and out broader. Our technical committee are the folks like staff. These are the people who know the weeds of everything. They're the folks who know exactly where utilities run. And this group was kind of on the same schedule as our advisory committee, but they got a little bit more under the hood and helped us verify our data sources and make sure that all of our technical analysis was sound along the way. And then I want to give kind of a call out to our subcommittees. So not listed here, but we did have two standing subcommittees throughout the Advanced Knox process. One of those was a subcommittee specifically tailored to our schools. So they had special meetings throughout the process where we sat down with just them, knowing the sensitivities of some of the stuff that the schools talk about and kind of their growth plans. That was something we wanted them to be able to do with the planning team without necessarily having to broadcast that to the entire community through all of our advisory committee type things. And then the other big picture was our utilities. You guys have a lot of utilities represented here in Knox County, and each of them are in different states of advanced planning or what they've got in terms of capacity and service today. So we wanted to make sure, as we're considering growth, that they had a seat at the table to look at those maps just as granularly as everyone else, and they could, raise the red flag, say like, whoa, like we can't grow there, we've already explored it, there's too much rock, and they could be the ones to help us verify that throughout the process. So Amy mentioned our public engagement. This was one of, I think, the shining stars of the Advanced Knox process. We had a really, really robust and involved public throughout the process. We came out in 3 primary rounds. So the first one I mentioned earlier, we just wanted to listen and learn from the community. They told us what they loved about Knox County. They marked up on maps everything that gave them heartburn at night, and really just kind of started to set the stage through that. Then our second round was our kind of biggest round. That's when we brought out the choices for how the county could grow in the future. We'll get into what those 3 options were here in a second, but we had a lot of really, really great guidance for that, and that feedback helped us establish our preferred scenario, which kind of was the foundation of the plan itself. And then once we had that, we went back out and let folks grade our homework. We took on the future land use map, we took on the transportation priorities, and essentially asked, did we get it right? Help us prioritize these investments. And then we refined the plan according to that feedback as well. I think one of the really important things to take away from this slide, it's not a number on here, but a number you guys should be kind of aware of, is we touched base with over 4,000 folks throughout the Advanced Knox process. A lot of those in person, thanks to how dedicated your all staff is. They, when we did that round 2, they were going out and doing what we called a meeting in a box, where anyone who requested a meeting, they would go out and walk them through the process, take the exercises to them instead of making them come to us at one of our more formal public workshops at one of the schools. So really big number and really great involvement throughout the Advanced Knox process. So I've mentioned it quite a few times now, but a little bit of a look into the scenario planning process. When I mentioned that this is kind of the cornerstone and unique to the Advanced Knox process, this is one of the things that allowed us to make this a truly data-driven plan. This is a really pretty graphic to show a very boiled down version of a very complex modeling system that takes a bunch of inputs and allows us to test how we want to grow. So through the scenario planning process, we had 3 scenarios for how we wanted to grow. One of those was what we call our business as usual, if we just keep doing what we're doing today. And then we had 2 other extremes for how we could accommodate that same number of people, but change the type of development and how we're bringing them and kind of allowing them to grow in the county. And then what we took with that was we took it to the public. They got to weigh in on it. Our committees got to weigh in on it. And then we revised it and landed on a preferred scenario that we'll talk more in detail about here in just a moment. The other benefit of our data-driven process and the more in-the-weeds analysis that we got to do through the scenario planning process was look at the fiscal impact of our development decisions. As you guys are aware, with every development that comes, there is property tax and sales tax generated from, additional development, additional folks spending their money in the county. But there's also a cost to serve that development, whether that be the county providing stormwater, transportation infrastructure, parks and rec, additional public safety. So with this, we were able to take kind of those development types and the typical tax that type of development would generate, as well as the cost that it incurs by the county to serve that development, and look at that net revenue and that balance to really understand the fiscal impact of the decisions we were making. And we did that for all of the scenarios along the way. So we could kind of make some more informed decisions. And what we wanted to really highlight on this is when we think about just doing what we're doing today in our status quo scenario, if the county changes nothing and we still have to accommodate the number of people that are coming here, we'd be running at about a $2 million annual deficit from a budget standpoint. If you guys have had any interactions with somebody in county government, they tell you that they're always trying to make those dollars stretch as far as they can. Our development decisions were getting to a point where we were no longer going to be able to stretch those dollars. And I think that's one of the things that we really want to kind of leave with you guys, that the criticality of this decision isn't just how we grow, it's how we grow and actually, continue to be able to operate the things that the county is known for and don't kind of have a lapse in some of those key features that we provide. Our preferred scenario, on the other hand, just, changing our development patterns and minimizing some of that impact allowed us to operate at almost $5 million annual surplus over our baseline. So I think it's a pretty big, impactful number when you think about that, and I feel like I need to clarify, this is $4.8 million annually, not $4.8 million between now and 2045, so think about that kind of cumulative over the next 20 or so years as we continue to grow and develop.
Yeah. So between the status quo and the preferred scenario, you're showing 33,000 jobs from 2045, 53,000 by 2045 in the preferred. I mean, what's the difference of 20,000 more jobs? I imagine that's where a big part of that 4.8 million is coming.
So going back to that development type, right now, the way some of the development in the county is set up, it's not really geared to attract development that is supportive of jobs. It's very geared towards more residential style development. So one of the things that we heard and that we were really intentional about with the preferred scenario is introducing more land use types that would allow for office parks or business parks, or really investing in the expansion of some of our industrial areas. And even the smaller scale stuff, as we think about some of the more mixed use type of zones that we'll be talking about a little bit later, allowing for more kind of shop floor level retail, whether that be restaurants or just regular shops or maybe just a tax office. So really shifting that development equation to recruit more types of development patterns that are supportive of providing jobs.
As job diversity of housing types, I guess my question is, how do you get some of those developers to want to do some of that mixed housing on these corridors, even though, you're going to allow it on paper?
That is a great question. It's something that we've heard a lot throughout this. I will say that we did have developers on our advisory committee that got to kind of weigh in on this. And I think one of the things that they shared with us is that if they felt like there was an appetite, they would build it. So I think having a land use plan in place that encourages that and takes away the opportunity for as much kind of large sprawling single family, just having the tools in place that make that easier for them to do is something that might encourage that some. And then some of it will be market, just inherently what people are driving. And I think we're seeing in other places, I think you guys have probably heard all over the news about every mid-sized city struggling with the missing middle type of housing. And as our communities continue to age, especially as they are here in Knox County, those conversations are going to get more and more pressure and more light, and people are going to be much more likely for the market conditions to follow that need that may not be as hot and pressing right now today in Knox County. I don't know if Amy or Jonathan.
Well, and I don't want to get too far ahead because we'll talk a little bit about kind of how the future land use map itself gets implemented and codified with your new UDO. And I think the conversations that you want to have as the UDO is being developed is to try to identify through conversations if there are barriers that exist through policy or procedures that are pricing out developers from building that kind of housing or encouraging them to go elsewhere. And so I think what this analysis has done really well is highlighting the need for that. But the real work is going to come in the next couple of years as you kind of get to work on the creation of a new UDO so that you can do more than just say we want this. We figure out how, from a policy to procedure standpoint, we can actually get it done.
What's a UDO?
Good question. A unified development ordinance. So basically the land use regulations that are wrapped around the land use map.
We'll talk a little bit more about that, but just kind of so everyone's on the same page. So if we do throw that word around, right now the county has subdivision regulations and a zoning code. A UDO would kind of overhaul and bring those two things into one common umbrella. So it's a little bit of a rethinking of how things are done today. Any other questions or comments? It was a great conversation. All right, so the future land use map. We're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into this. So we've told you a little bit about our scenario planning process. So as we went through the scenario planning process, we had these conceptual scenarios that were kind of the if we do this, what happens? And then we vetted that with the public feedback, and that's how we arrived at a draft preferred scenario. We took that and got leadership feedback through those various committees and through our staff team, and we revised the preferred scenario. And then that's ultimately how we got to our future land use map, which is the tool that you guys will be tasked with using as you kind of execute your jobs monthly for the Planning Commission. So for those of you who didn't get to be around for our second round of engagement, just a refresher, we had 3 very distinct scenarios. Our outward bound is what I refer to as our business as usual. This is if we just keep growing as we are today, kind of out into the county, largely single-family residential neighborhoods, with some pockets of some kind of more business and commercial there. Our town and country was kind of like the extreme opposite end, and that was if we really focus in on building out some unique kind of town center type locations and building more distinct communities that support those to limit the sprawl into the kind of more in-between areas on the map. And then our on the road again was a kind of a little bit of a different play on the town and country, but instead of focusing on more nodal type development and town center format, it focused our growth along the corridors, kind of not too dissimilar from what's happened in kind of the older parts of like the city of Knoxville, where you see everything developing along Kingston Pike, but in this case, smarter. I think before we move on from that, I think the one thing we do want to call out is our starting point ended up being the town and country. So the star ratings here are, as we went out to the public, they were allowed to rate it 1 to 5. And with each scenario, they were allowed to tell us what they liked about it, what they hated about it, if they could change anything or mesh together different features. And that was our starting point, but that is not, we didn't just pick that off the shelf and say, all right, the public said this, town and country is your solution, Knox County. So we're going to walk through how we moved from that kind of more illustrative to our preferred scenario.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
The star ranking, so were there any common comments amongst maybe all of them? None of them got 5 stars, right?
Yeah.
So like, were there common things that people just didn't like about everything, or it was just permanent that people commented and didn't like?
There were a few common things across all of them. I think we overwhelmingly heard that continuing to support rezonings that impacted the rural areas and allowed just single-family neighborhoods to pop up everywhere in the county, kind of regardless of context or what have you, was a concern we heard consistently. I think one of the other things that we heard was people's desires to maybe be more, I don't know if the right word's contained, but to be able to do more where they live and not always have to drive into downtown Knoxville or something over in Cedar Bluff to get their kind of daily services and needs, and to try to bring things as simple as grocery stores and other elements out into the county a little bit more so that they don't always have to drive 25, 30 minutes in traffic to serve their daily and basic needs. So those are just a couple of them that were kind of resounding throughout, regardless of which scenario you looked at. I think we also heard a lot about schools, kind of the desire to, be closer to schools, and that was kind of regardless of which scenario we're in. We obviously don't have control of that here at this level as we're making these decisions, so.
Thanks.
So, how do we get from those options to where we ultimately want to go? Sorry, I saw that interaction.
I mean, I was wondering.
I don't know what your vision difference is,
They look good. We can't see either. Sorry.
It's okay, me either. So with our preferred scenario, what we asked, kind of to the same thing that you just asked, is what about each of these do we want to retain? What did we like about each of the three different scenarios? What are the elements that we would change if we could about each of them? And what are some things that we feel like we just need to know a little bit more to confirm before we feel good about it? And those are, I'm going to walk through kind of key elements of each of these categories that we heard from the public in our committees. So when we thought about from the town and country scenario what it was that we wanted to retain and what the community told us, they really liked the mix of uses in close proximity. So to my point about folks wanting to be able to take care of their daily needs kind of in their community without having to drive to our more traditional commercial areas now, that was something that we heard quite a bit that they liked about this scenario or made folks more inclined to choose this scenario. They really liked the mix of housing options that the town and country scenario provided. We heard a lot, kind of to some of my earlier points about the desire to have a little bit more of an in-between or for some folks to have the ability to downsize. And just that mix of housing options was something that was really desirable to folks. The defined community centers, I think Amy said it best earlier when she talked about the community pride in Knoxville. We held our public meetings all over the county, and everyone we went to, folks were so proud of the community that they were in, whether it was Halls, Powell, Gibbs, like that's their community, they're proud of that, and they liked the idea that this kind of defined and built on what we've already kind of acknowledged and recognized as a community, as those kind of hubs throughout the county. They really liked in our town and country that we preserve more open space and more rural areas through kind of limiting that suburban sprawl and starting to focus that a little bit more and accommodate some of the housing that would provide with those more dense developments or neighborhood types. There's also a strong desire from folks to have more walkable development. I think this is one of the things that Amy mentioned, kind of going through a global pandemic. When people were stuck at home, a lot of folks got out to walk and bike a lot more than maybe they would have traditionally before. And when we were coming off the heels of the pandemic, we heard a lot of desire and appetite. It was so great when we could just get out and walk and there was no traffic, so it was fine. But now that everything's back to normal, I can't just walk down this road anymore. So thinking about how we provide things that are allowing them that opportunity to walk about. And then as we thought about things that we wanted to change, there was a desire for more corridor redevelopment. I think there's a couple of places we probably all have in our head around the county that are kind of some sad, washed up shopping centers along corridors that maybe we'd all love if something happened and they redeveloped and were a little bit different than they are today. We heard that a lot from folks in terms of, focusing some of our energy on those areas that are already there, they're already primed for redevelopment, and how we can funnel some of our energy into those locations to accommodate some of that extra corridor and mixed use type development. More fiscally strong places. So through that fiscal impact analysis for each of the place types, which Jonathan will go through in more detail, we're able to understand just how fiscally strong that place is, how self-supporting it is in terms of its revenue generated from property and sales taxes versus the cost to serve it. So there was a desire to invest more in fiscally strong places throughout the county. This one was a little bit unique. As we showed this map, this town and country concept was so nodally focused. It was so focused on building these kind of key community hubs. Folks were like, that's great, but I'd like to be able to get from here to here better. So one of the things that they wanted was, we call it more origin destination integration. That's plannery language. That probably means nothing to you. They want to get from point A to point B better, and they want more kind of interconnectivity between those places so it doesn't just feel like these isolated islands. So kind of in that category of what do we want to confirm, I've mentioned our utilities and schools groups quite a bit through that subcommittee work. We have a preferred scenario. we don't want to put that out there if the utilities can't serve it. We don't want to put it out there if the county doesn't have any intentions of supporting school enrollment in that area. So we had really detailed conversations with them where we rolled up maps and sleeves and kind of gathered around the table and let them poke holes based on what they know in our process, and we made modifications to the maps based on the feedback they provided us. We wanted to make sure that any changes we made to the preferred scenario from that town and country scenario was still fiscally viable and balanced. We wanted to make sure that we didn't deviate too far from that housing mix. And then we really wanted to focus on some key locations in terms of like that rural preservation component that has been so important to the community, as well as in this case that, the centers and corridors really was the right approach. So where we landed was with this revised preferred scenario map. This was the kind of iteration of all of those kind of questions, what we asked ourselves, how we shifted things around to try to get more at what the community told us they wanted through that round of engagement. I think one of the key things, I talked about this being data-driven process, for each of those prior scenarios, when we did go out to the public, we were able to report to them in kind of a report card format how those scenarios performed against our goal areas. So in terms of community character, conservation, you name it, we were able to report out kind of where they fell on that scale of supporting it versus not being as supportive of it. And we wanted to make sure that when we got to our preferred scenario, we were able to share how it stacked up against those goals identified by the community. So for our preferred scenario, there was a greater emphasis on centers and corridors, allowing us to kind of hone in on that community character component. Conservation, less land consumed, less impervious surface due to just the changes in development that we were proposing. Continued trend of making sure that we're growing within our existing service areas from an infrastructure standpoint. Making sure we maintain a good mix of job growth in centers and corridors to allow for that kind of delta of employment to come to the unincorporated portions of the county. Making sure that we still have a good mix of single-family attached and multifamily homes so that we give people that choice and the affordability points they need to be able to call the county home. Maintaining our connectivity, focusing on those corridors between those origins and destination points, and then making sure that we continue a really strong emphasis on our access to parks and trails and the things that folks need to kind of have fun, be with their families, and recreate. So how we took this from the scenario itself to the future land use map. The future land use map is a lot more granular and nuanced than our scenarios. I think Zelda mentioned this when we did our scenario process. Those were 25-acre hexagons. So it was a little bit of a blurrier version. We didn't want to get into going to the public with something that's like, here's exactly what we're doing with your parcel. So those 25-acre hexes allowed us to test policies and decisions at a much kind of higher level, but still enough granularity to see what moved the needle. As we moved into the future land use map, we were able to start taking those hexagons and turning them into the place types that Jonathan's going to talk about. And through that process, what we did was we ended up mapping those kind of place types or land use classifications to kind of more natural features, whether that be street center lines or natural boundaries between the city and county, or whether that be kind of more natural features like rivers, waterways. So we smoothed those boundaries, got a little bit deeper into that. But as we did that and kind of magnified 10,000 times the map from what was the scenario planning process to what would be kind of your all's guiding document in the future, we took a really strong look at what's existing out there today. So some things are newly built, newly developed, so we made sure that the place types reflected those locations. But then in cases where there might be vacant land or things with high redevelopment potential, we worked within that as well. And then back to our friends at the utility providers and schools, once we had that first blush of the map together, we're like, okay, tell us, like, is this real? Like, can we support this? Are there places where we need to dial it back? Or are there places that you're planning utility expansions that we can maybe be a little bit more proactive in providing some intensity of development that will be able to be served by those locations in the future? So that's how we got to a future land use map. And here is our new future land use map. So you can see kind of the difference in those nice fuzzy scenarios and what we were at when we were at a 25-acre hex versus where we are now. And you can kind of see the intentionality of where some of those different land use types are placed. I think one of the things that we want to kind of hone in on with our future land use map, this is really your tool for implementing the plan. There's lots of tools outlined in here, but this is kind of the cornerstone of the plan itself. And what it's intended to do is identify kind of the range of land use or development types that are appropriate in these different areas. And it's not intended that you guys go out and make this happen tomorrow. This is something that we know will be implemented over time, whether that be through kind of public and private investment in the development decisions that get made by independent property owners, or whether that's things that get realized over time through some of these policies and actions that we're going to talk about a little bit more in terms of some of the changes that you guys will be making to UDOs and zoning codes and all that good stuff.
In any of the tool sets that we have at our disposal, is there a map like this that is either dynamic, so you can isolate these things, or layered?
There is a dynamic map of the future land use map. It's available on the Advanced Knox website. I don't know, depending on what you wanted to layer, I think eventually this will be put into the normal KGIS means, and you could layer other things on top of it. Right now, I don't think
It's too early to go there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have a specific example of what you're thinking you want to be able to pull out?
Mainly just being able to, in terms, because it's a color set that you're really using to be able to isolate, so to be able to see how these things work together. To be able just to turn on and turn off each of these components to see like how much of that is there really, and not have it blurred with some of the other colors.
Sure.
Just to kind of have a better understanding of each of these components, how much there is or how much there isn't, in a fashion where you can turn them on and turn them off.
Okay, so each place type, being able to isolate each
Yeah.
of them. Okay, I see what you're saying. We don't currently have that set up.
Any other questions on the future land use map?
One thing looking at this that I see is the more commercial areas still look very linear, as if we were taking kind of not the town in place, but the next one over. Yeah. Are there ways to allow for more, I guess, in those corridor areas, larger radiuses around those because really in a lot of these scenarios, like specifically I'm looking at the east side of the county, if you were to utilize any mixed use on that, you're still driving, a couple miles from one side to the other. So there's not a lot of walkability. Is there any reason why there's not more clustered?
Well, I think it's not. So when you look at the different, and we'll get into I think that might be a good segue into talking specifically about place types, because the corridor mixed use, the town center mixed use, as Christina was touching on, there was definitely an interest in different types of place types. So not just focusing on commercial along our corridors, but allowing a mix of uses and have them our town center type development.
Right.
So I think that was more of an intentional focus of this preferred scenario. That makes sense. And then also you have to think about, trying to balance those different interests, because we definitely heard on the east side of the county, there was a lot of interest in preservation. And so, trying to be very thoughtful about where you might put that additional, growth, commercial growth specifically in the future, and really focusing on nodes in that area. Because we've not only heard that through this process, we've heard that through previous, efforts that we have, planning efforts we've done in these part of the county.
I think one thing to add to that is it may not be as obvious on this static, really zoomed out map, but one of the things when you think about those more walkable, compact growth categories, those can actually happen in a smaller footprint in terms of the land that they require, because those are the places where we're going to build up a little bit. So they may not be as obvious when you're looking at a map at this scale, because we can do that in a more confined footprint and kind of bring out from around it. And it may just not be as evident if they're on here, if that's happening, because they are more compact.
I think the scale definitely has a lot to do with that on this map, because it's so zoomed out. But,
Yeah.
okay.
Well, I think lunch is supposed to arrive, and this is a really good stopping point if it is.
Yeah, so the lunch is supposed to be here at 11:45, so it hasn't been food yet.
Okay, we can keep going.
Yeah.
Just a minute.
Let's jump into the place types, because I don't think that'll take too long. When we think about the place types though, I think it's important to know that these aren't zoning districts, right? These aren't the regulatory kind of pieces that you're implementing. Instead, what we're doing with the place types, we've got 13 different paintbrushes, if you will, that we're using to paint the study area. And as we paint the study area with these place types, we're hopefully you can kind of blur your eyes a little bit and start to see some of the things that Christina talked about a little bit earlier about from those scenarios, what we want to reflect, what we want to change, what we want to confirm. The place types is starting to reinforce that. The place types too are, in some cases, and we talked about this, they're describing places that already exist in the study area. In other places, they're reimagining existing uses and again using the place type palette itself. So we've got 13 different place types, and we've kind of organized them into these buckets. So you can see the walkable compact growth, the suburban growth, the rural areas, and then kind of these special districts or other areas. And so in a lot of respects, maybe if you exclude the other areas, the place types are organized around kind of the context that we're hoping to evoke as we create these places and ultimately implement the future land use map. So just kind of going through these kind of one by one. The first one is the traditional neighborhood. Now we use the word traditional. That shouldn't be confused with kind of what we think of as usual residential, in a place like Knox County and really in a lot of places. This is traditional in the sense of kind of the inner tier neighborhoods where you have kind of a diversity of housing types and where there is multifamily in a traditional neighborhood is typically pretty small scale.
You're using this like D&D. It's like
Yes,
okay.
Traditional neighborhood design is another way that you could kind of refer to it. But at the end of the day, the traditional neighborhood place type should have some of those neighborhood amenities, schools, and parks. And it's not inappropriate for there to be some small kind of neighborhood scale commercial office and civic uses in these areas. The way that the place types, all 13 of them, well 11 of the 13 are kind of communicated is, as you can see, there's primary and secondary uses. We talked a little bit about the housing mix, and then we get into the forms and attributes to kind of give a sense of the scale of the places that would exist in the place types. For the most part, we're not talking about specific densities within the place types. There's some general guidelines within the place types about what type of density might be appropriate in some of them. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do with the future land use map is strike a balance between providing enough guidance or specificity so that it's a useful tool for staff, but not being so specific that it kind of stifles any kind of interpretation or change. And that really is a fine line as we try to figure out the level of detail that we want to communicate with the place types. The corridor mixed use, I think, Logan, to your point, there's a difference in the future land use map between that very linear corridor commercial and the corridor mixed use, which is kind of these pulses of mixed use activity that we think would occur along the corridors. This is in the walkable kind of category for a reason. So we envision the corridor mixed uses as more walkable. And when we talk about mixed use, we can think about it in terms of like the vertical mixed use, like commercial on the bottom, residential on the top, as well as horizontal, where there's kind of a cohesive design, but the buildings themselves might not be mixed use. But I think regardless, all of the walkable place types need to emphasize connectivity to nearby residential uses, to your point a little bit earlier.
Question, I'm looking at the transportation primary and secondary modes, and what you were saying about corridor mixed use. you said that, this is listed as primary mode automobile. So when I look at the pictures, they look like that would not, like you would have to take an automobile to get there. But that the primary mode, once you were there, would be walking or biking.
Yeah, I think that's a safer interpretation. It's kind of like a park once mentality where
Yes.
you might have to drive there, but once you're there, there's enough kind of complementary uses. There's enough kind of attention to the design detail, and the place itself is interesting enough that people will be willing to kind of move around on foot.
So if we're in alignment on that interpretation, why would the transportation mode primary not be walk? Because that seems like it would be consistent with the traditional neighborhood development. Like, of course, you have to drive a car to get there, but then your primary mode, once you are there, is walking or biking. What?
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point, and I think it's worthy of like some consideration on our part.
I think we were thinking about it as, well, you in order to get there, you have to take an automobile.
Yeah.
So that is the primary mode. You're not gonna get there likely, at least in the near future, without the automobile. So that's the primary mode of access to that space.
So the T&D, the primary mode of access to get to that space is walking or biking?
Potentially, so the idea is that, yeah, so you're able to move around, walking or biking, yes. Yeah, through the neighborhood.
Sure, through the neighborhood, but that seems like it'd be the same as the corridor mixed use. Like, once you are there, you're on foot or two circles. But
Yeah.
it just seems like the images support the same primary and secondary modes, but they're written differently.
Well, and we'll talk one more, and then we'll let you grab your food. Because there is like this one more kind of in the bucket, and that's the town center mixed use. And I guess generally speaking, if we're gonna kind of talk about this on the most basic terms, the town center mixed use is kind of the largest, kind of most compact nodal development that would occur within the future land use map. And again, kind of promoting that connectivity to the surrounding uses. And you can see the primary uses there, commercial, office, and then the residential, especially the multifamily residential kind of gets into the primary use for that one. And then some of the less dense residential could be appropriate in a town center, especially if it's got a very large footprint, but we would certainly consider that as secondary. Any questions about that before you go grab some food? Are there any logistics for the food? Free for all.
Unless you told Dallas or Dory that you had a criteria. That should be noted on there.
And once they get their food, we'll just kind
We're
of
just
keep
gonna
moving on.
resume, so we're just gonna keep working through it rather than taking a break to eat. Is that okay with everybody?
Yes.
Okay.
So somebody has to be the first to
Yes.
get up and grab a box.
I will, and see it appropriate.
So-
That's just intentional or
Yeah.
intentional.
So we talked about the three place types that were of the walkable compact growth. Now we're going to get into the four that are in that category of suburban growth. And so these might feel a little bit more familiar to you all. The first is suburban residential, and this is kind of as it's described. It's mostly single family, usually for the most part, not large lots, nothing generally larger than an acre. But at the end of the day, the word suburban there is for a reason. So you think of like the curvilinear roads and the large blocks and the neighborhood design that you see in the suburbs. That's what we're capturing with this place type. The next one is a little bit different. It's suburban mixed residential. It's similar to suburban residential, but there's a greater mix of housing types. And so I think you can kind of see that in the primary and secondary uses that are are listed there. Then we get into corridor commercial, and so again, I think it's helpful to distinguish the corridor commercial from the corridor mixed use. And so I think as you are able to get online and kind of zoom in on the map a little bit, and the colors don't kind of blend together, you'll start to see some of the distinction there. The corridor commercial really is along your major transportation corridors. And it's capturing the shopping centers and the big box stores, and is very much auto-oriented. And then the last one in this bucket of suburban place types is business parks, and these are just your office parks, your employment centers. So nothing super fancy or out of the realm with the business parks. And so as we think about kind of the next bucket, we get into more of the rural place types. The first one being rural conservation. If you think about some of the things that Christina talked about a little bit earlier, about the things that we heard routinely, and that was that there's an appreciation for the rural nature and the natural resources, the natural places that we have in Knox County. And so the rural conservation is really just kind of the future land use maps way of identifying those forested areas, the ridges, the wetlands, and saying these are worthy of preservation. Not to say that no growth will occur in the rural conservation areas, but if they do, kind of as you can see here in the graphic on the bottom right, it's a clustered design where the lots themselves are small. But they're small so that we're preserving more of the rural area. The rural crossroads commercial is, simply these little commercial nodes, a lot of which probably already exist that occur at, where two roads out in the rural areas are meeting. So those rural crossroads are where you're starting to see or have currently see some commercial activity kind of out in the county a little bit. We've got civic and institutional, and I think it's important to note here so that when we talk about the schools and the universities, all of the civic uses, that the design of these places likely vary significantly. Like if you think about a single site, versus a university campus or kind of a secondary school, kind of the look and feel of it could vary quite a bit, but at the end of the day, it's all civic and institutional. And the last two, we don't get into a lot of detail of the land use mix or the housing mix or the form attributes for these two, because they're truly kind of special districts. And so you can see mining and heavy industrial and parks and open space. And so while those two things are very, very different from like a land use and form standpoint, there's not as much nuances that we have to cover in the future land use map. I'll pause there. Any questions about, I know I went through those last few relatively quickly, but I wanted to pause and in between bites, see if you all have any questions you want to ask.
Did you just skip over rural living, or was that just?
Was it?
You said we started with rural conservation, but I may have just misheard.
I guess there wasn't a slide. There was no. That was, I guess, unintended. But yeah, rural living is just the least dense kind of residential place type that we have.
Yeah, it's mainly, well, if you'll have it in front of you, so it's in your plans, on page 37 of rural living, and that's primarily ag, open space, single family, large lot, residential, it would be reflective of some of the ag properties that we have now. It might not be active ag, but are still larger lots.
Is it possible at this juncture, not this minute, but like before it comes to us, to have the definitions applied for the transportation primary and secondary, like what those are actually supposed to be saying?
just defining what we mean by primary and what we mean by secondary.
Yeah.
I think that that's clarification that we can do.
Are there specific ways to protect or prevent development in the rural conservation? Like and this may come later, but with the slope, hillside protection, like is that coming into play? Or I noticed you mentioned the smaller lots and clusters, but I guess that I can understand that on a site where you've got, let's say, 50 acres and you put everything in one spot. But what if someone's trying to develop a series of 2-acre lots, and so they have the same limitations, or I'm just curious how we can actually protect the rural areas with this. Is there strong protection?
Yeah, and I think that's where the land development code will kind of come into play. There's actually a good segue to take us where you say.
Yeah, also it's good, the hillside ridgetop plan will still be used as a guide. As you all know, it's not codified in the county, but it would still be used as a guide.
Could it be codified in this?
It's not currently proposed to be codified.
We do have a kind of an action item that we've covered in a minute that talks about kind of performing an analysis of these protections and almost like revisiting it, but it isn't like codified in the comprehensive plan.
On the traditional neighborhood, when we were getting food, I was asking Amy, I'm struggling to think of an existing traditional walking neighborhood in the county.
Yep.
And I could find it even more challenging to even imagine one moving forward, because those are typically kind of center city on grids. How do we, can you speak to that at all? Do we have any that I'm not thinking of? And then how in the world would we?
Tim, we were over here thinking that maybe that was Belltown. It doesn't exist now, but
Well,
Yeah.
you have to cross a major road to even get to the commercial. I guess that's a bit,
ish.
maybe. Is it on a?
Sorry to interrupt it, but
Is it developed on a grid? I can't remember
I thought they were.
That's some alleys.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay,
And it's a mix of housing types.
okay.
And I think that brings up the bigger point that I may have kind of glossed over when I was introducing the place types, is that they're really, some of these in traditional neighborhood and kind of the town center probably, especially the walkable mixed use place types, they don't necessarily exist today, right? But I think that there's an appreciation from kind of the engagement that has occurred throughout this process and the technical analysis that is underlaid to the overall plan, is that those types of places are desirable if they're located in the right areas of the county, right? And so when we think about this plan being a 2045 or a 2050 plan, we're trying to set the expectation that these types of places probably should exist in the future, even if it's hard for us right now to imagine a world in which they would exist.
And I think one more thing to add on to that, the implementation of those isn't going to be as easy as grabbing a big greenfield site and putting out a single family subdivision today. A lot of those may be achieved through kind of, as we're thinking of this as a 2045 plan, redevelopment or kind of the turning over of and aggregation of parcels and stuff into those areas that have been identified that already have stuff there today. It just may not be the highest and best use, and when that does turn over hands or somebody buys it, that would be the opportunity to really think about it through more redevelopment initiatives, because likely a lot of these kind of more specialized things that we're introducing aren't going to be things where we've got a developer who can just go buy 130 acres, maybe outside of the Belltown situation. Like, it's not going to be quite that easy to implement it in that sense.
this is sort of, I think, connected to what Logan was asking. Seeing as the hillside protection is just a guide and not codified, are there things that this body can do or your research can do that provides some type of scaffolding guidance to make this vision come to light? Like, if you want to preserve these areas, it would be recommended that there be ... so that there's sort of a scaffolding to make this happen.
I will say that the rural conservation was one attempt at that. The rural conservation was very strategically applied to a lot of our hillside and ridgetop areas because sans that and the hillside and ridgetop protection not being codified, it could become anything. It could be completely flat and then become a suburban neighborhood. It could be a business park, what have you. So by overlaying the rural conservation, that is one way to protect it a little bit more without there being a codified tool, as kind of strict as what the hillside and ridgetop protection will try to do. That was
That's
something
the thinking behind that, but
yeah, that was the thinking behind it. It was kind of why that was intentionally introduced as a new concept into the Advanced Knox comprehensive plan.
And this is jumping ahead a little bit, but if you look at on page 52 of the plan and 57, for example, it talks about, so for 57, ensure that development sensitive to existing development character, and there's a couple policies here that are calling out additional analysis needs, assessments, creating new standards, saying that number 7 on page 57. So creating large lot agriculture zones. So this gets into the next step, which is we need to look
how do we
at
make
standards
policy
for
reflect?
code, to actually implement a thing like this.
So, you all should have this kind of worksheet or table, in front of you. What we're trying to kind of communicate, with this is that you have place types, right? And then you currently have a set of zoning districts. The intent, as we'll get into, the way to implement the future land use map is to kind of reimagine your land development regulations. And so what this table is doing is kind of showing you the crosswalk between your existing zoning, the future land use place types, and then ultimately can be revisited once the new Unified Development Ordinance is written. And so on the left side, we've got those 13 kind of future land use place types. And across the top, you've got your existing zoning districts. And this is really kind of providing a guide to show kind of the relationship between the place types and the zoning districts. And so some of them are directly related and some of them are only partially. Did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, well, I guess I will add, so this is one tool and it is included in one thing that as this plan hopefully moves forward, that we'll do as another tool, to help you all. You're very familiar with our land use classifications table. This replaces our land use classifications table. But what we want to do is take that table and pull this information into it to make it a more useful tool for you all, as well as our county staff.
What transportation?
All right, you guys have heard us say it, it is a comprehensive land use and transportation plan. We've spent a lot of time on the land use component of that because it is probably one of the bigger and more complex things that we've had to navigate through this process. But the transportation and infrastructure piece of it is just as important, and we need to make sure we're bringing that alongside the land use decisions that we're making as a county. So I've got some big numbers on the screen here. I think first thing we want to share with you guys is that as we made our transportation decisions for the Advanced Knox process, we did what we in planner world like to call financially constrain our list, or to put it kind of normal people language, and balance our checkbook. The county doesn't have an endless budget. There's actually pretty strict rules on how transportation dollars get spent, whether that be from the federal or state sources, as well as some of the county sources that they use to leverage those federal and state sources through matching funds and what have you. So we did a pretty deep dive into the county's CIP all the way back to about 2004, 2005, I think, and tried to do an assessment of how they were spending their money, what types of projects they were funding, kind of the fluctuation year over year of whether their CIP was bigger or smaller, whether it grew, whether they had to dial back. And using that, we were able to create revenue projections of what we think, kind of given what we know today, that the anticipated revenues for transportation in the county would be. So those are the numbers you're seeing here. We like to think about that in our world in what we call funding bands. So just, our more near-term, mid-term, and long-term time frame. And once we kind of, looking at our transportation recommendations, these span the gamut of anything from safety projects, capacity. There's a project type here that you guys may have heard about in one of your earlier meetings, but we're calling it modernization. As everyone knows, a lot of our county roads are really rural and substandard today, but they don't necessarily need to be blown out into a giant 4-lane boulevard type road. So we recommended in many of these cases modernization to bring them up to a more current design standard with 11 to 12 foot travel lanes, shoulders, and in some of the cases where the land use permits, perhaps some sidewalks. So you'll see those there. And then the multimodal layer that you're seeing, that's primarily the county's focus on the greenways across the county and building out and connecting the rest of the system. But with this, we lovingly as a project team called it our universe of projects. And if anyone's been in the space of government for a while, we know that our needs far outweigh the amount of revenues. So you'll see here indicated by the yellow dots, those projects that we're actually able to fund with the revenues. We left all of the projects in because they will be important at some point or time. And we want to allow the county to remain flexible if for some reason there's a great grant opportunity. That need is still documented. They can try to go after that to fund some of those projects that may not be reasonably funded with the sources they have today. So just taking that step and making sure that the money that we have in the bank and the projects that we've identified can actually reasonably be implemented in the time frame of our Advanced Knox plan.
How can we get more money in the bank for transportation?
They really good folks at TPO and TDOT, get really good at writing grants to the feds and raise taxes.
Did you say that last thing again?
I mean, like, really.
Yeah, really.
I think all this comes down to, I know we're doing as good as we can do,
Yeah,
so we don't have enough money.
it really comes down to the tax piece of it. We're seeing a lot of communities, cities and counties leveraging referendums just to fund transportation. So even if it's not wholesale sales tax or property tax, like a finite, next 7 years we're gonna accept this and we're gonna get this list of 12 to 15 projects. That's not a very popular opinion, but it is one of the most likely ways to.
Yeah, I mean, because by far as commission, I know everybody can speak to it, that's the number one thing. It's about zoning and about densities, but at the same time, it's about what's happening with traffic. It's getting worse. I mean, because people are moving here. Jim, I mean, you're from a, and I don't know this, that's why I'm just totally asking me from a budget perspective in engineering. I mean, what, like your budget is for expanding yearly. You can probably, like on these projects here that they've identified.
On a capital budget, we have seen slight increases the last few years. I think 5 years ago, we were around 12 to 13 million. This past year, we were up around 19.
Okay.
Our operating budgets, I think, have increased probably consistent percentage-wise with those. So like for this year, we got $7 million in resurfacing. Probably 5 years ago, we had probably 5. So there is increases. It's just obviously, percentage-wise, smaller than what maybe we'd all like to see.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of people view it in the public, it's a cart and a horse, and it's like, we've always operated under, okay, build it, then we'll kind of, or I should say, build a new subdivision or build a new commercial development. It generates taxes, and that allows us to improve the road. Right? But I think people are starting to now say, well, we'd rather have the roads improved before that, but like Rich was saying, there's not enough money to.
Well, I mean, I don't know how the budget works, I'm not in the county commission, in the politics. But it's obvious it's not being appropriated in the right place. And I'm not into that, but in my own opinion, which I'll expect to give, that's not being given correctly for this county in the revenues. But that has nothing to do with you all either.
Yeah.
So, but if we're gonna do this, we definitely have to address this.
Yeah.
You know, cause I like the plan.
Yeah.
I really like the plan, but I see hiccups.
And I think that's like a really interesting point because one of the things through that fiscal impact analysis that we got to do, we did get to look at whether or not those developments pay for themselves. And there's a slide in there with kind of the arrows that point. You can see clearly which of those developments pay for themselves. So our mindset of just like if development comes, we'll eventually use that money. Some of those developments will never pay for themselves. And that's just the nature of what they are. But we have to have them or we don't have housing in the county. So just thinking about kind of that balancing act and trade-off is something that we're trying to tackle from multiple avenues, whether it be through what we're talking about here, the transportation-specific revenues, or bringing that development mix more into balance so that we do have more self-sustaining developments happening that do generate the tax revenue to pay for themselves and the improvements that are needed.
So you're, and if I'm understanding you correctly, more like the rural ones are probably gonna be the ones that aren't paying for themselves, is that fair to say?
They're pretty neutral. It's actually our more traditional suburban residential that doesn't pay for itself. There's a lot of street center line miles that go into those that the county ends up taking over and having to pave, and it's very expensive. And that doesn't even account for the things like drainage or sidewalks or anything else that's constant.
I mean, we're doing the best we can with what we got. I mean, that's the fact, but we aren't doing good enough. And it's not due to anybody here. It's due to the amount of money that we need in order to accomplish our goals. Thank you, sorry.
No, you're good. Thank you for that. So, this is something that's a little bit new that the county's been doing for a while, but we're formalizing a little bit more through the comprehensive land use and transportation plan. And that is the concept of these transportation programs. So these are programs that have a set of money associated with them. I think the numbers are in your plan that's printed out. But they're not tied to a specific capital project. So when we say pedestrian improvements, that's not necessarily tied to a sidewalk on, this road from point A to point B. It is something that the county will have a program for annually. And as a development goes in and there's a critical gap that they need to connect it to get to the next corridor commercial area, or a critical gap that they need to connect it to a park or a school, this is where this bucket of funding will come in to allow them that flexibility to be able to more nimbly respond to some of those gaps. It can also be served for some pedestrian safety, whether that's a request for crosswalks or pedestrian kind of signal heads. This is kind of the conduit for some of those smaller scale improvements that come up throughout each year for the county. Our spot safety projects, the county and the TPO recently participated in a regional safety action plan, and that had a ton of kind of low cost safety measures in it that will complement the work that the county's already been doing. I interned for Jim for 3 years, so I used to field the calls of like, hey, there's like branches down and I can't see to turn left. Those types of improvements, as simple as it sounds, cost money to do. You've got to send the crew out there, they've got to have the equipment. So this is the conduit for providing some of those more kind of really low cost, have to get them done tomorrow, safety improvements, whether that be adding all-way stops, adding advanced warning signs, clearing side distance problems, or in some isolated cases, adding some extra like shoulder width so that we prevent some of those run off the road crashes that are really popular in our more rural parts of the county. Traffic signal modernization, this one's pretty straightforward. The county maintains a little over 80 traffic signals, and those cost money to operate and upkeep. That technology, just like the technology in your pockets, goes out of date pretty quickly. So for them to make sure that they're operating the most efficient and connected system they can, we have a set aside of money for that. And then these last two here are thinking more in terms of maintenance. So the county does have a assessment going on to kind of understand the status of the bridges and culverts across the county. Many of those are getting really old and outdated and will need improvement. So this sets aside a pot of money for when that assessment is done, the county can strategically go and improve those bridges and culverts to make sure that they're good for the next 75 to 100 years. And you heard Jim mention it, but our maintenance priorities, that's really where we capture the county's repaving efforts that they do annually, whether that be what they do with their own money or their partnership with CDOT on the state aid roads. So just a little set aside that helps fund kind of the daily operations of everything that the engineering and public works team has to go through each year. So something a little bit unique, and this spawned mostly from the transportation discussions, is if you look at that future land use map, there's probably some things that you see where we're recommending some place types in areas that today we have a hard time envisioning that they're going to be able to support that. So part of our plan has recommended a couple of areas for future study. Those 4 up there on your screen. And with these future studies, what we envision, if you guys were around a couple of years ago for the Hardin Valley Mobility Study, where they got to take a really deep dive into the Hardin Valley community and do some really detailed traffic data analysis and modeling to understand kind of more granularly some of those improvements, like add a left turn lane here, some of the stuff that when we're looking at a countywide level, we don't have the data at this scale to do it. We'd probably blow the county's budget to try to analyze the whole county to that extent at this point. So these were kind of hot spots that today there's not a huge need showing up in the traditional data sources. There's not huge crash problems that are clearly identified via trends on the map. There's not traffic reports saying this area is super congested, but we know from what we heard from the community that as growth pressures continue in these areas, those things are going to come up and they're already starting to be visible. So on the heels of the comprehensive plan, have recommended that staff initiate small area plans of these 4 areas to take that deep dive that some of our areas that are already more developed in the county have had the opportunity to do so already.
So almost an hour and a half ago, there was a slide that was up that kind of talked a little bit, kind of at high level, about what a comprehensive plan was or is. And one of the words that was on that slide was the plan that you have in front of you needs to be a playbook for the future. And I think the policies and actions that we're going to introduce right now is kind of our way of making sure that the document itself is a playbook, that it sets forward a course for implementation, even if that course could be windy and difficult. But it also sets forward some accountability for staff and for you all on the commission to make sure that at the end of the day, the actions that we take surrounding development decisions and growth decisions are constantly leading us toward that vision statement that you saw at the beginning of the presentation. And so what we thought we would do is just kind of tell you how it's organized. We'll use a few examples to help you understand how it's related. But at the end of the day, there's these 8 goals, and those are the long-term desired action or outcomes for the overall plan. Then you've got a set of policies. There's 23 policies in this document, right? And then there's, I think, 81 actions that support the 23 policies that help us implement the 8 goals that lead us toward that one vision statement. And so there's a layer, there's a hierarchy for how the plan is organized. And I certainly don't want to spend the few minutes that we have kind of going one by one through all 81 of those. Particularly because I think, depending upon the hats that you all wear kind of outside of this room, there's certain sets of policies and certain sets of actions that you all are just naturally drawn towards. And I think you probably want to invest your time and your expertise in those specific policies. Just like the place types, just like the place type palette refers to some areas that exist in Knox County, and some are completely new. So is true with the policies. Some of the policies are going to reinforce the current direction that the county is taking and has long taken. Other policies are going to be a shift in direction. Again, so that we can lead toward those 8 goals and ultimately kind of get us closer to that overarching vision. And so you'll see this table on page 50 and 51 in the document. And across the top are the 8 goals. And then you'll see on this slide 14 of the 23 of the policies listed. And this is our way of kind of holding ourselves accountable to suggest that, okay, which of these policies are achieving which of the goals. And so the dark green that you see there suggests that that policy directly advances that goal. And if there's a gray circle, It's not directly advancing it, but it's certainly supporting or reinforcing that goal. And then you get into kind of each of the actions. So each of those 23 policies has a subset of actions that are pushing us in that direction. Again, I'm just going to talk a little bit about a small collection of those. The first, you can see the policy there: improve the predictability and transparency of the development process. Goodness, wouldn't that be nice, right? And the actions to support that policy, that first one is a big one. We've talked about it quite a few times today, and that's to create a new unified development ordinance. And I think as you go through and you read all of the policies and actions that follow 1.1, you'll see that there's a trickle down effect that this first policy or this first action has kind of throughout the overall implementation strategy. A lot of the things that we say that the county needs to do to move forward points back to making sure that we get that unified development ordinance right. Luckily, you all in the commission are going to be involved in that process kind of going forward. The second,
Sorry, one more on that one that we did want to call out, just as a fair warning, is there will be, one of our recommendations was to provide training for the elected and appointed officials. That's you guys in this room with us. So Amy's team will be putting together kind of a more robust training on the heels of the hopeful adoption of this plan that kind of walks you guys through the nitty gritty and fine grain of how you will use the updated future land use map, the place types, and kind of what that'll look like for your all's operations moving forward.
okay, that's okay. So 2 is ensure that development is sensitive to existing community character. And to just prove that I'm not a liar, you can see kind of the list here. Update or create buffer or transition standards, update landscaping, lighting, provide protection for the ridges used in open spaces, create standards to encourage the preservation of open space. At the end of the day, all of those things need to be represented in that UDO that's forthcoming. We jump ahead to number 4 in the interest of time. That's to incentivize walkable mixed-use centers, corridors, and neighborhood service nodes as the preferred form of commercial development. And I think the realist in some of us can recognize the challenge that comes with trying to achieve that. But it's important if the overall future land use map is trying to move us in that direction, especially as it relates to commercial development. We need to acknowledge that, and we do that with this, policy. And then certainly, you can see that very first action, 4.1, creating new zoning districts to implement mixed-use place types. I think there's an understanding just in that one statement that our current codes and regulations are ill-equipped to deliver us the future land use map that we put forth. And then the last one that we just wanted to highlight today is 9, and so that's on page 59 of your plan. And so this is coordinate infrastructure improvements with development. And I think to your point, it gets at the kind of the cost to serve, the return on investment that we're receiving kind of long term. I'll call your attention in particular to 9.3 here, and that's focused growth in areas already served by adequate infrastructure. And so I think that there's, again, an acknowledgement there that, through the actions that you all take as a commission, as the county commission takes over time, that we need to do so kind of in the interest of the long-term fiscal health of the county.
We are getting really close to the end of the presentation, but still continue to chime in with any questions you've got along the way, and we'll try to reserve some minutes here at the end for any more overarching questions, just kind of remind you guys we're almost there. So how we get this done, Jonathan's talked a lot about our actions. One thing you'll notice on the pages in your report that Jonathan covered, it doesn't say who should do the action. And we all know when you take CPR training, the first thing you have to do is point to somebody and say, hey, you. or it's not gonna get done in terms of that first call to 911. The same thing goes for our actions in delivering the comprehensive plan. So as you kind of get towards the end of your document on page 71, that action list is summarized kind of in brief here with a little less granularity and detail to the action itself. But the most important part of this is that it says who the lead entity is for taking that next step. So when we think about creating our unified development ordinance, we have clearly outlined that engineering and public works will take the lead on getting that initiated on behalf of the county. And then that the supporting entities will be the planning group, the mayor's office, and that's kind of the way it'll get delivered and achieved as we think about implementation. So that is there for all of them. I will take a minute while we're still on this slide before we move forward. And the next slide will help us kind of think about this kind of in wholesale view of the plan itself. But this is something that will be revisited annually, and staff will track their performance and kind of progress on these. These things will find their way into your all's work plans. So you're not out of this yet. Some of these will be trickling down your all's way to kind of help tackle. So you'll see that kind of throughout your daily practice of what you do and how you get things moved through planning commission, what have you. And staff will kind of report back on this annually. They'll update that status, whether it's kind of in work, underway, something future. They'll also revisit whether or not things are irrelevant. Maybe you've taken that first step of studying something and it's like, this just isn't gonna work for us anymore. So those things can be updated along the way as well. So kind of a big piece of this puzzle is what we're referring to as our plan management cycle, or kind of how often you update or amend the comprehensive plan. This is one of the nice little graphics in your report. A couple of things to highlight here before we move on to the next slide is there will be that kind of annual monitoring of the plan. This will be something that Jim's team should reference when they put together their CIP every year. This should be something that as planning staff are going through development approvals and rezonings, they're referencing back to the comp plan. So it'll be used year round, but there's a couple of kind of key inflection points that we want to think through and talk about with you guys today. One of those being how often you should update your comprehensive plan and that future land use map that's within your comprehensive plan. We know that your all's current process is monthly. That makes my skin crawl. We don't work with many communities who update their plans that regularly. I think there's a couple of reasons why we want to think about that being less frequent. One is maintaining the integrity of our plan. I think if we're updating it monthly, it starts to lose some of the integrity of that big picture that we established and respected, put together with our community. And I think another kind of couple of pieces of that is as we're going through it, it doesn't give us the chance monthly to understand our progress or take a kind of more holistic look at the implementation of the progress that we're making toward the vision and goals. So our recommendation through this is an annual update. With the exception of these first 2 years, we're recommending that staff do a biannual revisit and update. Because it is so new, there is a lot of changes, so a little bit more frequent here at the beginning, just as you're getting used to it, you're figuring out the kinks and what's working and what's not, but then work our way towards only updating it annually moving forward. And then the last thing I want to hit on here is that in addition to those kind of annual monitoring and revisitings, every 5 years, or maybe more frequently, maybe it's 3 years, maybe 1 year at 7, take a more holistic look and do a more kind of wholesale minor update. And similar to how we do it at Knox, but please don't wait 20 years. At that 10-year mark, do a more wholesale revisit of your comprehensive plan to make sure that it's still tracking.
When you said that you're on a monthly cycle for updating the plan, you're referring to the plan amendments
Yes.
that we as a
Yes.
I just wanted to clarify.
Yes, you guys are on a monthly cycle for plan amendments, and we're recommending that other than these first 2 years, you move to a once a year plan amendment cycle.
So the way that would look practically is that it would mean that the only time a developer was able to bring forth a project that would have a plan amendment component would be once a year? Is that how that would, no.
Wait, you can still do rezonings and stuff along the way, but it won't get reconciled.
You can do rezonings, but in terms of a plan amendment itself would not be able to be made on that monthly basis. So they need to look in, to this matrix, like what is allowed currently within that place type.
So unless, again, I'm just trying to make sure I had it, that right now, if there's a development desired that, I mean, because our plan is so out of date, this is just where we have found ourselves. But someone will come with a development and it requires these plan amendments to make that happen. And our body, along with county commission, has to decide about that. And in the recommendation world, that would not be the case. That developer would be, if they really needed to modify the plan to make something that was just so phenomenal happen, then they would need to wait until that one period to bring that forward.
Yes, so it's not unlike how in the city, we only have quarterly amendments.
Mhm.
So, you know.
That's a little concerning to me.
Has a
Yeah.
development. But let me say, I think you said if they had something really unique, but we have other tools in the zoning code, so like the plan development tool, so
Yeah.
that is another tool that can be used.
What if there's an error in the plan?
Is that what the period that you were describing, that because it's so new, that in the first 2 years, there would be greater flexibility?
And I think one thing that we're leaving out that's really important, so with the new UDO update, hopefully by introducing these extra zoning districts and extra development flexibility and what they can build, you need to do those less often anyway, hopefully. Right now, your development code is so limited that you're seeing that a lot, not to mention that the future land use map is 20 years old. But when you think about adding in all of those walkable mixed use types, and them now being applicable things, hopefully people are having to ask for plan amendments less frequently in general, because we've given them a greater palette to work from at that starting point. And the biannual, as you guys know, the zoning code hasn't been updated yet, so that's to help you bridge that gap between when you do have that new kind of slate of options to give them more choice in the development process.
Understanding now what that recommendation is matches what, so I asked this question at some previous presentation of the material as it was at that point, because there was a comment about plan amendments and how we saw them with such frequency and how this would make that not the case, which I think most of the commissioners here, not all, but many of us are new enough that that's the only world we have known.
Oh, yeah.
Is that every week every month there are all these amendments. And one of your colleagues said that we should only be seeing those really once or twice a year. So what you're suggesting is consistent with what they said.
Yeah, I want you, and I understand that this is probably concerning because it is a change in how we have handled these in the past, but keep in mind, I think it was just stated, so 3 years of time and effort have been put into this plan, a lot of community input. And so there's an expectation, so if you are amending it on a monthly basis, you're basically like, I mean, it really diminishes the effectiveness of the plan, and it also diminishes all that public input. So when you are thinking about this particular piece of it, think about it in that context of like, you know, maybe there's another time frame that we need to discuss, but also just keep that in mind, like so much time and effort to put in this. And going forward, our intention is, and it would be codified in this plan, that we would be updating this on a much more regular basis than we've updated any of our plans. In the last
That's always the hope.
20, 30 years.
That's always the
No,
hope.
it is something that we will do.
Yeah, and like Tim said, I mean, if there's a mistake in the plan somewhere, I mean, every one of those lines isn't gonna be perfect, or if there's a new road built, you know, but yet, okay, you can't apply for a year to change it. I mean, even if somebody builds a brand new road, you know, I mean, that's the concerns, that type of thing. I mean, because I've dealt with it in the city and the county, and it is somewhat punitive in the city trying to line up your application with your landowner, with the market, and they say, oh, well, you can't do that because you can't even apply for a sector change or 1 year plan change for 3 months. And now you're saying for a full 12 months. I'm just voicing a concern, a serious concern.
And keep in mind that, so if this is revisited every 6 months for the first 2 years, if we're seeing some trends, like this is an issue, like, people are getting caught up, not able to, do what they wanna do, but, and then also that it meets the intent of the plan, those things can be changed.
Right, well, I mean, we talked about, you know, even with the missing middle, and, you know, we voted all that stuff in, where we're talking about it being a living document, things like that, that shutting it down for a full year is not living, you know, I mean, I just see it being problematic, only doing it once a year.
Why couldn't you make an exception if you can demonstrate there's an error in the plan, that you can update that at any time?
That's what I was gonna say, could we make like a list, and we have an exception, let's say like annually, we have an exception, and then maybe we can provide some standards to meet that exception for the planning commission to then be able to change it, so it's not just like, we can change it on the fly, but if we're presented with the right circumstances, we could make an exception, so.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And our current sector plans, I mean, most of the amendments we're seeing now are, you know, trying to go through LDR or MDR or, I mean, they're very density focused, right? A lot of our sector plans.
I think you're right, a lot of them are.
Yeah,
I was-
and this doesn't have density
We have the
thresholds
flexibility.
here, so.
Oh, but by default it does. If you read the, you know, if it's, I forgot the names of the suburban, you know, I mean, it only is gonna support certain types of housing. You know, but if there's a scenario where, okay, maybe multifamily where you would normally go from LDR to MDR, it's not allowed. Because per year, to even be considered that.
So it matters what your zoning code says, so that's the guide for development. So we still have the planned residential zone, which are, you know, your density is determined in that zone, by whatever you offer.
I mean, I'm understanding it now, I feel more comfortable because it's consistent with what the previous colleague said. We should be seeing it a couple times a year. And if we have a built-in, to your point, John, this is a living document, for those first 2 years, we have the opportunities, these windows to fix it. Like, if there's something that we see as this trend where things are out of whack, we have the opportunity to amend and make that right, because something wasn't said as it should be. I mean, that feels like there's some safety gaskets built in.
Yeah.
We've had errors in the plan that weren't discovered for 15 years.
I would just want that the errors in the plan be designated, I guess how do I say this? There can be ways of saying, you know, if you demonstrate an error in the plan in these ways.
I think that's what Katie was saying, was about putting an exception.
Yeah, if we just put
less
like an
than
exception category,
And
and not
then approve
necessarily put a
it.
time limit on it, like I agree that we shouldn't review this every 2 seconds. But if we had a category where we're presented with this perfect circumstance, where this new road and this development just don't make any sense, but we wanna do it, we could then see whether that proposed plan meets a list of categories that would then grant an exception for us to be able to amend the plan in certain situations where we're not like on the fly, but we have a set kind of guideline for that.
I understood what you were saying,
Yeah.
and in theory, I think that's a commendable way to try and address it. I think I'm reflecting on the years of service on the planning commission and where I've seen, you can write, here's the list of things, if you meet, 3 of these, and those can get muddy quickly. So I would be concerned about like how that actually was articulated and how that was figured out, so.
I think one more thing on this before we move on, and like Amy said, this may not be the perfect solution for it right now, but it is our initial recommendation from the advanced Knox process, is that as these are coming up, I think just reiterating, one of the things we heard so resounding throughout the community engagement process was the lack of predictability in the development process. And I think amending our plan monthly plays into that lack of predictability because the plan is constantly changing. So I think we need to think about that kind of through all the pieces together and try to figure out the right balance where we're not being punitive to somebody who does have, the most perfect development that's gonna come in, and we don't want it to, languish for however long, and then they lose the property, what have you, and we miss out on this great community opportunity. But we also don't wanna change it so much that the 4,000 folks who weighed in on this and kind of spent their time and energy helping us create this vision are essentially telling us that we don't care what they said, by changing it so regularly because a developer or somebody wants to change it for some other benefit that may or may not have community good. All right, last slide, we wanted to kind of draw your guys' attention to a couple of additional implementation actions. So this first one here we've already hit on, that's the modifying the process for plan amendments with the goal of eventually getting to annual, but over the next 2 years being every 6 months, as you guys kind of work through getting to know the plan and getting used to it. We mentioned the action about that initial training. We think that's something that should be ongoing. You guys don't sit on the planning commission forever and ever, amen. So as new folks come on, cycle off, making sure that training is something that's maintained and kept so that you guys can be serving the community in a consistent way. The implementation evaluation, that policy and action sheet on 71, that's kind of our report out on what we're doing every year, how much progress we've made on making Advanced Knox and kind of the goals and visions a reality. That's also our opportunity to review those things that aren't working, or as we've thought about some of the trends that might have come up over the year, this is our place to kind of document that and make sure that we're addressing it in some of those updates. We have on here the update of the State of the County report, recommending this on a 3 to 5 year basis. I think this is something that's driven more by how much the county is growing and changing. So 3 to 5 years is typically pretty good. If you guys see a couple of years of just tremendous growth and something kind of unusual or different than what we would expect, that might be something you revisit a little bit more regularly. But a lot of those data sources anyways are only available every 3 to 5 years. So revisiting it again next year is not going to tell you much different than what we looked at this year as part of this process. And then you're requiring all staff reports to reference the comprehensive plan. So this is something that you probably already see in some of your kind of documentation that you get in your packets monthly, but making sure going forward that all development applications, code amendments, rezonings, policy, anything directly references kind of how it supports and furthers the mission of the comprehensive plan. All right. That is our last formal slide. We are here for any more questions that you guys may have. We've appreciated kind of the back and forth. It makes me feel less like a lecturer, which is why I did not get a PhD and go to school to be a teacher. But happy to entertain anything else you guys have while we're here.
A few questions about the transportation aspect of this. So my understanding has been that part of the goal here is to maybe limit some of the sprawl and also have more walkable and connected areas. And as I look at it more, it seems like there's, well, and again, the map that we have right now, some of the colors are hard to distinguish between, but the entire suburban growth section of uses, none of those have, they all only list automobile as the source of transportation. And then to contrast that, the photos that are in here all show sidewalks, and which are what make these photos nice, is the fact that they're pedestrian friendly and accessible. And then also looking at the anticipated funding, the pedestrian category only has about 3% in all of these. Everything else is automobiles. And I also, maybe it's in here, I haven't seen anything about alternative means of transportation, so bike lanes, public transit, anything like that. I'm confused about this because it seems like it doesn't really, yes, I understand that there's changes and improvements for those aspects, but it still seems like alternative forms of transportation to automobile are a little bit on kind of a back burner in a lot of these. I know that that's not the intention, but is there any specific reason why there's not more focus on alternative transportation and that these zones don't list other alternatives?
Yeah, Logan, I'd like to talk a little bit about this. Look, somewhat misleading in the maintenance projects. All the road infrastructure that we currently do always has that built in, so it's kind of inclusive in that. For instance, Kent Hollow Road that we're going to go to construction with this year. Obviously, it's wide and taking out all the hills and curves, so it's got that safety component, adding turn lanes where needed. But the other thing we're doing is putting sidewalk on one side and a 10-foot wide shared use path on the other. Shaw Road, for instance, that's currently underway, has bike paths on both sides of the street as well as sidewalks on both sides of the street. So a lot of that multimodal stuff is baked into the cake already. So not to say we can't look at other things, but I did want you to know that's a little bit misleading because it's already baked in.
That's definitely helpful to know. Was there any consideration for future, because if we're thinking long-term, I would hope that as we grow and have more densities that there might be some public transit options in the county. Has there been consideration of that in this plan and how we could plan for public transit connectivity?
I can take the first stab. We did have some discussions around this. Kat was involved in our committees as well. Right now, it didn't seem from anything we heard from the public that there was a huge appetite or that we are developed in a fashion that would be supportive of that kind of transportation right now. The places that we heard the most appetite was actually partnering with some of those business parks to provide workforce transportation. So that was something that did come out of kind of some of the conversations. But in terms of what you see with like fixed route service with CAT today, I think when we talk about that 10-year update, if the county has made progress on recognizing and realizing the vision of this, then I think revisiting that transit conversation in terms of something for us would be kind of the opportune time to do so. But as the county is developed and laid out today, and with kind of the way attitudes and mentalities were of the folks we were talking with, it's just there's not a there for it at this moment.
Okay.
And I think, sorry, one more thing I did want to call out. In policy 9, there is one thing that Jim's team's going to undertake as part of one of their actions, and that's to establish typical road standards. And to Jim's point, they're already considering complete streets, kind of use that word that incorporates bicycle and pedestrian facilities in a lot of their design projects. But these typical standards would kind of set that expectation for what bicycle or pedestrian accommodations would go on new road projects for their collectors of materials.
Yeah, and that's helpful to know that that's kind of baked into some of these, and then also with the long-term, in 10 years revisiting, and then with the other land use areas, it seems like maybe there potentially, and maybe I'm thinking about how this would be used incorrectly, but potentially some danger in not listing secondary modes of transportation as NA on these, because if I'm looking at this as a guide for my development in one of these areas, if I'm in the traditional neighborhood or even in the I think business park lists walk bike as a secondary, I'm going to go into it with an understanding, and actually also the rural crossroads does too. But I'm going to go into that with the understanding that I need to have considerations for pedestrian, walk bike. But if I am looking at corridor commercial or suburban residential, I think there's another one in that category that doesn't have that, suburban residential. Even though a lot of these pictures are showing sidewalks as kind of a guide here, it's not really discussed as creating pedestrian walkability. So I don't think people would be expected or would expect to need to include that. So if you're doing a subdivision in one of these and it's not saying that the consideration of pedestrians is part of this requirement, then why, or I guess part of this area, I see that being potentially dangerous by not listing those long term, because we see so many cases where we're looking at subdivision plans and saying, oh, this needs more connection, more pedestrian walkability. And if we're not mentioning it in here, it seems like it's going to be hard to push for that as we develop it. Is there a reason those were left out, or am I maybe seeing that wrong? Like, are there not implications like that by leaving it out?
I think the thing to remember with these, and I think that is a good point, is like, are we sending the wrong message maybe by leaving those absent from funding. But I do think the thing that's missing in kind of how we will use it ultimately is we have to think about the unified development ordinance. And each of these place types will have corresponding zoning districts, and that's where it'll spell out very clearly, you have to develop sidewalks on your frontage to X, Y, and Z. So even if this doesn't imply that the secondary mode is walk bike, we're still going to have policies that require developments to improve their frontage with sidewalks or kind of provide that pedestrian access into their developments. So I think that's kind of the second piece of it, but I do think the point you raised about whether we're sending the wrong message of it implying that when we talk about corridor commercial, we don't care about the ability to bike or walk into it is a valid concern about how the needs are portrayed. But these are backed up by the unified development ordinance that does have that kind of like the teeth to requiring those pieces.
Would it be possible to reword, and back to what Karen brought up earlier with the transportation on the mixed use and traditional neighborhood and then town center mixed use? It seems like corridor mixed use should be flipped where we're focusing more on walk bike, because same as traditional neighborhood and town center mixed use, the walk bike, you still have to drive to get there, but it's listing walk bike as the primary. I just wondered if it would make, this would seem more cohesive if we were saying in the mixed use TN and then town center mixed use, all of those have walk bike as the primary and automobile as the secondary, and then in the suburban residential, suburban mixed residential, corridor commercial, and I think that's it, have it flipped so that it's saying automobile is the primary and then walk bike is the secondary. It may be too late in the game to add in wording like that, but that seems to be more cohesive if we're trying to say there is a primary and a secondary, to have those listed that way.
I think that's definitely something that we can take a closer look at, and you all, I mean, this is kind of the process now, so.
Yeah.
You know, you all should think of the comprehensive plan, this is planning commission's document, you know, I mean, it is something that you all were tasked with, creating and developing, so, you all can make commitments to this process as well, partner.
So, just listening over the last, I guess, 5 years of what the communities talk about, and they do talk about transportation, being backed up, they talk about stormwater, flooding, and the third one, it would be great to see how it could be a part of the summary of action plan and the who we would converse with, and that could be integrated in the conversation are our schools. It would seem to me that when we talk about developing nodes where people can walk and be a part of their communities and have that sense of how proud and sense of community, everything that you told us about in these 4,000 folks that gave input, it would seem schools are at the heart of so many of these communities. I know Powell and when you think about it, the Hardin Valley, look at what's already happened out there and how much that's exploded. It seems like schools would, especially being that this is Knox County's plan, it would seem like there'd be a stronger component of future schools, where those are going to be located, because that's going to be huge to drive economic development, income tax base, the need for walkability and multi-use type, all of these different 12, 13 zones, the ones that would be applicable. It just seems like that, we seem so much to say that's not part of us, but in a comprehensive plan like this, it would seem, would it be possible to have more of an emphasis on it?
And I will say that, Mayor, we've met with the school administration several times. We're going to continue to do that. One of the things that we have on our policy is the capital projects update meeting. They're now included in that. So I think the communication there has been much improved, because you're right, in the past it hasn't been as good as it should have been. But with the new COO over there, Garfield Adams, he's been very receptive to that conversation and providing us capacity numbers for the schools, and so I think that we're heading in a good direction there.
That's just such a family driver. When you bring in new businesses, often the folks want to know, where would my child go to school? How far away is that going to be? And right now it seems like we're moving students around a lot, and we sort of break up that sense of community when that happens. So it's not on the action plan. Sharing facilities, using parks and rec. I mean, I think the schools are mentioned once or twice in the action plan, but it's more as ancillary. So if something could actually be put in there where it requires us to talk more, would be.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought this up. So one thought is, we talked about doing these annual evaluations, and so, putting that in, adding some language that says specifically that we will meet with the schools on an annual basis and try to be more proactive in learning about what their future plans are, because it obviously will influence growth and development in the community. So
I think a lot of folks call into question the impact on schools number. And I know there's a formula and we plug it in, that's what it is, but they'll say, what do you mean there's gonna be 12 students? It's a giant subdivision. And so anything that shows, I think that we're, and maybe, we can help support the need for extra resources to support development and communities and walkability and our thriving communities, our city. Yeah. Thank you.
thank you all so much.
Good job.
I appreciate it. And thank you.
Thank you, guys.